The audience expected laughter. What they got instead was a moment so tense that even the studio crew stopped moving. Sandra Bullock had just leaned forward in her chair, looking directly at Joy Behar across the table, when the mood suddenly shifted. The crowd sensed it instantly, the kind of pause where everyone realizes something unscripted is about to happen. Quick heads up, subscribe to Backstory Uncovered, because what starts as a normal conversation here is about to take a turn no one expected. The segment had started like most talk show interviews. Sandra Bullock was on the show promoting her latest film, smiling and joking with the audience as Joy Behar guided the conversation. Joy held up a photo from the movie. "So Sandra, first of all, congratulations," Joy said. "People are loving this film already." Sandra laughed lightly. "Well, that's good news. Otherwise this would be a very awkward interview." The audience chuckled. Joy nodded with a smile. "You've been doing this a long time now," she said. "But people still say you're one of the most relatable stars in Hollywood." Sandra tilted her head playfully. "Relatable is code for she trips in public sometimes, right?" More laughter from the crowd. Joy leaned forward a little. "No, seriously," she said. "Fans feel like you're one of the few celebrities who doesn't feel distant." Sandra nodded. "I try not to be," she replied. "Life's complicated enough without pretending everything is perfect." The audience applauded softly. For a moment, the conversation flowed easily. Sandra talked about filming challenges, funny behind-the-scenes moments, and even joked about embarrassing mishaps on set. Then Joy shifted the topic slightly. "You've also been pretty vocal over the years about Hollywood culture," Joy said. "About pressure, expectations, all of that." Sandra nodded cautiously. "Yeah, sometimes the industry forgets that actors are still humans." Joy raised an eyebrow. "But critics would say actors also live very different lives for most people." Sandra shrugged lightly. "That's true in some ways." Joy continued. "And sometimes when celebrities talk about struggles, people at home roll their eyes." A few audience members laughed awkwardly. Sandra smiled politely, but there was a slight pause before she answered. "I get that reaction," she said. Joy leaned back in her chair. "Because to the average viewer," Joy continued, "Hollywood problems can sound a little dramatic." The audience murmured again. Sandra folded her hands on the table. "Well," she said calmly, "some of them are." The crowd chuckled. Joy smirked. "But you've also spoken out about treatment of women in the industry." Sandra nodded again. "Yes. Because that part is very real." Joy tapped her pen lightly on the desk. "But here's the thing," she said carefully. "A lot of people watching might say, things have improved. A lot." Sandra's expression changed slightly. "They have improved," she agreed. Joy tilted her head. "So when celebrities bring these issues up again and again, some viewers feel like it's exaggerating the problem." The audience reacted with a mix of quiet applause and uncertain murmurs. Sandra blinked slowly. "Exaggerating," she repeated. Joy shrugged. "I'm just saying what people say." For a moment, Sandra didn't respond. She looked down briefly at the table, then back up at Joy. "Well," Sandra said calmly, "sometimes what people say depends on who they're listening to." The audience clapped softly. Joy smiled. "Fair point." But she didn't stop there. "You know what else people say?" Joy added. Sandra raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "That Hollywood loves to talk about change, but doesn't always change." A few audience members gasped quietly. Sandra sat back in her chair. "Now that," she said slowly, "is actually a fair criticism." The crowd seemed surprised by the quick agreement. Joy nodded. "So you admit it?" Sandra gave a small smile. "Of course. Hollywood is full of contradictions." A ripple of laughter moved through the audience. "But," Sandra continued, leaning forward slightly, "the bigger question is whether people are willing to listen when someone talks about a problem." Joy crossed her arms. "Oh, people listen," she said. Sandra tilted her head. "Sometimes," she replied. Joy raised an eyebrow again. "What do you mean by that?" Sandra hesitated for a second. Then she said something that made the room noticeably quieter. I mean, sometimes people listen until the conversation becomes uncomfortable. The audience reacted with a soft, "Oh." Joy looked straight at her. You think this conversation is uncomfortable? Sandra paused. A small smile crossed her face, but it wasn't the same light-hearted smile from earlier. Well, she said carefully, I think it just got a little more honest. The audience clapped again. Joy tapped the table again, thinking. Let me ask you something directly, Joy said. Sandra nodded. Sure. Joy leaned forward. When celebrities confront these issues publicly, do you think they're helping the conversation, or sometimes just creating headlines? The audience gasped softly at the bluntness. Sandra looked at Joy for a long moment. Then she slowly leaned forward too. Well, Joy, she said quietly, that depends on whether the person asking the question actually wants the answer. The audience went completely silent. Joy blinked once, clearly caught off guard by the response. Then she leaned back slightly in her chair. Oh, she said with a small laugh. So now we're turning this around? Sandra didn't laugh. She simply looked at Joy and said something that made the entire studio hold its breath. Not turning it around. A brief pause. Just being honest. And suddenly, what started as a routine interview was turning into something no one in the studio expected. For a few seconds after Sandra Bullock said, just being honest, the studio stayed unusually quiet. Joy Behar leaned back slightly in her chair, studying Sandra with a half-smile, the kind hosts use when they're deciding whether to push further or let something go. The audience could feel it too. The conversation had crossed that invisible line where things stop feeling like a casual interview and start feeling very real. Joy tapped her pen lightly against the desk. Okay, she said with a small chuckle. Honesty I can handle. A few people in the audience laughed nervously. Sandra nodded, calm but clearly focused. Good, she said. Because that's really the only reason to have conversations like this. Joy tilted her head. But you think people stop listening when the topic gets uncomfortable? Sandra took a breath. Sometimes, she said. Not always. But sometimes the reaction isn't curiosity, it's dismissal. Joy leaned forward again. Dismissal from who? She asked. Sandra didn't hesitate. From people who assume the issue must be exaggerated because it doesn't affect them. A quiet murmur ran through the audience. Joy held up a hand slightly. But that's also part of public debate, she said. People challenge claims. They question things. Sandra nodded. Of course they should. There was a brief pause. But questioning something and immediately minimizing it aren't the same thing. The audience clapped lightly. Joy crossed her arms thoughtfully. So you feel like that happens often in Hollywood discussions? Sandra gave a small shrug. Honestly, it happens everywhere. Joy smiled faintly. That's probably true. The tension eased for half a second. Then Joy added another question. But Sandra, some critics say these conversations in Hollywood only come up after something controversial happens. Sandra raised an eyebrow. You mean like a scandal? Joy nodded. Exactly. Sandra leaned back in her chair for a moment, thinking. Well, sometimes that's when people finally feel safe enough to speak. The audience grew quiet again. Joy looked intrigued. What do you mean by safe enough? Sandra rested her hands on the table. Imagine being in any workplace where speaking up might cost you your job, she said. A few audience members nodded. Sometimes people stay quiet until enough voices join in. Joy paused. That's fair, she admitted. The room relaxed slightly again. But then Joy added one more thought. Some viewers might say celebrities have the safest platform of all, she said. Sandra looked directly at her. You'd think so. Joy waited. Sandra continued. But fame doesn't remove consequences. The audience reacted with a soft, mm. Joy raised an eyebrow again. You think there are consequences for someone like you speaking up? Sandra smiled slightly. Oh, absolutely. The audience laughed, thinking she might be joking. But Sandra shook her head. No, really. Joy leaned forward again. What kind of consequences? Sandra hesitated for just a moment. Then she said something that made the studio quiet again. Being labeled difficult. A few people in the audience murmured in recognition. Joy nodded slowly. That word does get used a lot. Sandra smiled faintly. And it's rarely used for the same behavior depending on who you are. The audience clapped louder now. Joy looked out toward the crowd, then back at Sandra. Well, you're definitely not being quiet today, she said with a grin. Sandra laughed. Probably not. Joy smiled too. But I'll give you credit, she said. You answered the question directly. Sandra nodded. That's the only way these conversations work. There was a small pause before Joy added one last comment. You know, I think people at home might be surprised by how honest this got. Sandra looked out toward the audience briefly. Maybe, she said. But honesty shouldn't be surprising. The crowd applauded again. Joy nodded. Fair enough. She turned slightly toward the audience. Well, Sandra Bullock, everybody. The studio filled with applause as Sandra smiled and waved lightly. But even as the clapping continued, it was clear the conversation had left people thinking. Because what started as a routine interview about a movie had turned into a moment where neither side backed down, and both said exactly what they meant. And now we want to hear what you think. Do you agree with Sandra Bullock's point about people dismissing uncomfortable conversations? Or do you think Joy Behar raised a fair concern about Hollywood discussions? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Backstory Uncovered for more behind-the-scenes stories about the moments that get everyone talking.